welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today's episode is a little unique because instead of covering a single movie, we're covering a single person in multiple movies. That person is Donald Rumsfeld, who held many powerful positions over his decades-long political career in the United States, including the U.S. Secretary of Defense, a position that he held twice, from 1975 to 1977 under President Richard Nixon, and then again from 2001 to 2006 under President George W. Bush. And while there hasn't been a single movie about Rumsfeld yet, his prominent and controversial career has been included in movies made about other political figures. So, today we'll be talking about Rumsfeld in the 2018 movie Vice, which is about Vice President Dick Cheney, a friend and colleague of Rumsfeld during his time as the Secretary of Defense under Bush. We'll also learn about Rumsfeld in the 2008 movie called W, which is about President George W. Bush. And then we'll finish up by covering our first documentary here on the podcast, 2013's The Unknown Known, which is the result of director Errol Morris conducting some 33 hours of interviews with Rumsfeld himself. Joining us today to uncover the accuracy of Donald Rumsfeld in the movies is William Cooper, who you might remember from his times Based on a True Story to talk about movies like Moneyball and Vice. William just published a fantastic new alternative history novel called The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld, which you can find a link to in the show notes for this episode. Before we chat with William, though, let's set up our game for this episode. Now, if you're new to the show, since Based on a True Story is all about separating fact from fiction in the movies, you'll get to practice your skills at separating fact from fiction in this podcast episode with a game of two truths and a lie. So I'm about to give you three things that we're going to talk about in this episode. Two of those are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Rumsfeld was a political rival of George H.W. Bush during the Ford administration. Number two, Rumsfeld was inside the Pentagon during the 9/11 attacks. Number three, Rumsfeld was known for advising George W. Bush against Iraq having WMDs. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, see if you can figure out which one of those is the lie. And if you're watching the video version of this on YouTube, you'll see I'm holding up the envelope that has the answer inside. We're going to open this at the end of the episode and see if you got it right. Okay, now it's time to connect with William Cooper about the historical accuracy of Donald Rumsfeld in the movies. Since we're talking about Donald Rumsfeld in three different movies today, let's start with a twist on the historical letter grade that we usually do. So this time the grade is not for the entire movie, but just how the movie portrays Rumsfeld. And our first movie today is 2018's Vice, which you and I have talked about before. It's episode 335, if anyone wants to cue that up to listen to after this. But in Vice, Donald Rumsfeld is played by Steve Carell. What letter grade does Vice get for how Rumsfeld is brought to the screen?
I would say a D-. I think Vice is a good movie and an entertaining movie. I love Steve Carell, and Christian Bale's awesome. In terms of accuracy, I thought it was just really hardly
just not
hardly even approaching one element of accuracy. Just kind of way out there on that particular character.
Donald Rumsfeld was a real person, and that's it.
It's about right. Yeah. No, it was, again, good movie, great actors, the whole crew involved in that movie, very talented people. Accuracy-wise, it was not very good.
Well, after Vice, we'll chat a little bit about Rumsfeld in 2008's W, about George W. Bush. And in that movie, Donald Rumsfeld is played by Scott Glenn. What letter grade does he get for his portrayal of Rumsfeld?
C-.
Okay, a little better.
A little bit better. A little bit more, at least not whole cloth in that one, I felt like. But still really not, at the aim there was not, again, I didn't feel like the aim or the ultimate product was about accuracy. I think it was more about entertainment. And in some ways, W was really the both movies were about the focal point, Cheney and Vice and Bush and W. So it's understandable that maybe Rumsfeld was used to add some flourish as opposed to be accurate.
Well, I'm real curious about the next one because finally we're going to wrap up our discussion today with 2013's The Unknown Known. And that's actually a documentary interviewing Donald Rumsfeld himself. So there's not an actor portraying him. But for that one, let's shift back to the overall letter grade for how accurate the documentary is, because I know we all like to think that documentaries are entirely accurate, but I think we've all seen documentaries that can stretch the truth a little bit. The example I like to give is Ancient Aliens, that some claim to be a documentary, but that's a topic for another day. So what does The Unknown Known get for its historical letter grade?
I'd say A minus, maybe even an A. I'm a huge fan of Errol Morris. The predecessor documentary that he did about Robert McNamara is one of the most powerful films of any genre, in my opinion. Is unbelievably powerful movie, and I felt like the Rumsfeld movie was a follow-on sequel to that in a way. I thought it was great, and I thought it was well done. I will say documentaries can be extremely misleading. So the higher grade is not simply because it's a documentary. I actually thought it was a really good production and not misleading and not unfair in fundamental ways. And of course, you got a lot of raw material that was straight from the historical record.
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out because, sometimes people think movie is entertainment, documentary is truth. And I know that's what it's supposed to be, but that's not always what it is. Especially it's talking about something political too, where, politicians tend to stretch the truth sometimes too.
Absolutely. Documentaries can even be worse because people can be lulled into the false confidence that something is true because it's a documentary. And then through omission, it can tell a totally different story or amplifying the things that maybe weren't as big of a deal. But I thought the Rumsfeld documentary was really good. And I learned a lot. I had already knew a lot about Rumsfeld by that point in time. He's somebody I've always been really fascinated by and interested in. And I actually learned a fair amount and was surprised about it. And it was fascinating.
No, that's good. Well, with the letter grades done, let's start digging into a little more detail, starting with 2018's Vice. That movie tells a little bit about Donald Rumsfeld before his political career. For example, it mentions that he was the former captain of the Princeton wrestling team. He was an elite Navy jet pilot before becoming a congressman. But as you mentioned before, Vice is more about Dick Cheney, so we don't get a lot about Rumsfeld himself. So can you fill in some more history that we don't see in the movie about who Donald Rumsfeld was before he was in politics?
Yeah, I think the movie takes some snapshots of Rumsfeld that are accurate. He was a wrestler, and that was a big part of his upbringing. And a lot of people think that his background as a wrestler sort of embodies his approach to politics and business, being very aggressive and confrontational even. So they got that right. He was entered politics in his 20s. So there's not a ton before politics. Entered politics in his 20s. He was 29 when he was elected to Congress for the first time in a district just outside of Chicago. Was in Congress for a number of years, worked for Nixon for a number of years, was prudent. It's a question about whether it was luck or prudence or a mix of the two, but he was in Nixon's administration in kind of a lower tier post. And then right before Watergate exploded, he left to be the NATO ambassador in Brussels. So when everything was going, sort of the floor came out from underneath the Nixon administration, Rumsfeld had just gotten to Brussels and was focused on other things. And his reputation, I think, was preserved in some ways. There's no evidence he was involved in the Watergate scandal or that he was in the machinations with Nixon and others. But I think for anybody who was actually there on the ground in the administration, it was a tough time, and Rumsfeld was able to get out of it. He came back when Ford took over because Ford was a big fan of Rumsfeld. They were good friends from their time in Congress. And then shortly after Rumsfeld arrived to help Ford, he brought Cheney in, who he'd met during the Nixon administration as one of his deputies. So that's how that all worked together. And then Nixon became, Rumsfeld was Ford's chief of staff. Cheney was his deputy. And then Rumsfeld went and became Secretary of Defense for the first time. And Cheney was elevated to be chief of staff for Ford. And that's how the two of them really got started.
That's the kind of thing that, I mean, the timing of that is very coincidental, but sometimes coincidences actually do happen too. So
they do. They do. And I think Rumsfeld was pretty astute. I mean, my view of Rumsfeld is a mixed picture of positives and negatives. The novel really tries to paint that full picture of somebody who's not just good or evil, but a mixture of things. And one of Rumsfeld's strengths, politically at least, is he had a good nose for, at least earlier on in his career, a good nose for controversy and when to avoid it. As he got older and came back into politics, some might argue he ran to the controversies, but at least early on in his career, he really tried to avoid them and had a pretty good instinct for it. And that was the prime example of that, getting out of Washington at the right time.
Well, if we go back to the movie after Rumsfeld is elected to Congress, the movie's dialogue suggests that Rumsfeld was a little different than other congressmen. And there's a line of dialogue from the movie I want to quote here. It says, quote, "Most congressmen use their power like an axe, best and brightest. Rumsfeld, on the other hand, used his like a master of the butterfly knife. And like any master, if you got in his way, he would cut you." Does Vice do a good job explaining how Rumsfeld wielded his political power?
I think it's really simplistic. Again, entertaining, good movie, but very simplistic and it exaggerated. I don't think that, I mean, there were a lot of people who disagreed with Rumsfeld, but I don't think he, in the Ford administration, in Congress, in the 60s and 70s, I don't think he was stabbing people in the back left and right. One of his chief rivals politically during that time was Henry Kissinger. Especially with Ford, Rumsfeld and Kissinger were two really strong voices, and they had some disagreements. Rumsfeld was much stronger on the Cold War, wanted to take a much harder stance against Russia than Kissinger did. Kissinger's philosophy was more strategic coexistence with Russia, where Rumsfeld really wanted to be more confrontational. And they, after they left government, ended up being very good friends. Rumsfeld writes in his biography that he and Kissinger have been very close for quite some time and really good friends. So there were rivalries and there was certainly a lot of political maneuvering going on, like you would expect from a politician. But I don't think he was stabbing people in the back or doing, really underhanded sort of deceitful things. I think that was more of a exaggeration.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that makes politicians will disagree. That's kind of part of their job. But, the stabbing in the back part that's mentioned in the movie, or it doesn't say specifically stabbing in the back, but it gives that impression. And so, yeah, I'm glad you clarified that though, because that was definitely the impression I got, was basically my way or the highway.
Well, he certainly intellectually could be like that. He could be my way or the highway in the sense they had very strong views and wasn't prone to compromise intellectually with what he wanted. He's very deferential to the president, very deferential to the chain of command. So if the president gave him an order, he would follow it. And I think he would do so in a straightforward way. But he was very opinionated and very confident in his views and very, very, and one of his biggest flaws of them all was not listening to the critics, not listening to other people. And I think that was one of the reasons he made such a big mistake with the Iraq War, was not listening to other opinions. So in some sense, he was very strong-minded and he was my way or the highway. But I don't think he was doing things that were, extreme. I don't think he was, blackmailing his opponents or lying to the president or committing crimes to get things done. So I think there was some exaggeration in the movie, even though he was a very strong personality.
Okay. Well, you mentioned friends, and throughout the entirety of Vice, it's not Kissinger, but it's pretty clear that Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney have a very close working relationship. It's Rumsfeld who seems to give Cheney his big break into politics, working under him during the Nixon presidency. Then later in the movie, when Cheney becomes vice president, the impression I got was that it was Cheney who convinced President Bush to appoint Rumsfeld as the Secretary of Defense. How much of that really happened? And can you unravel the working relationship that Cheney and Rumsfeld had?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate in broad strokes. Rumsfeld and Cheney were always very close. They agreed on a lot of things. There were some differences between them. I think Cheney was a little bit more conservative than Rumsfeld, a little bit more hawkish in certain ways of foreign policy, but in general, they got along very well. Really close allies, and absolutely true that Cheney played a big part in Rumsfeld getting the job as Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. And it was interesting because Rumsfeld was a political rival of George W. Bush's father. So during the Ford administration, Rumsfeld and Herbert Walker Bush were rivals, didn't get along well. Rumsfeld didn't respect Bush's intellect. Bush thought Rummy was kind of his nickname's Rummy. That's what everybody calls him throughout his career. So I sometimes do too. But Bush thought that Rumsfeld was, always jockeying for Ford's attention in ways that, weren't really fair. Not deeply mischievous or anything, but not fair. So they were real rivals. And Cheney convinced Bush to hire Rumsfeld as the right person for the job as Secretary of Defense, even though they had that history, and even though Bush's father wasn't a big fan of Rumsfeld.
Did the younger Bush not really have much of a beef with Rumsfeld then, where they were not opponents necessarily, I guess, then it was just his father, right?
Correct. So younger Bush and Rumsfeld never had any issues, didn't know each other well prior to Rumsfeld joining the administration. But the younger Bush was certainly aware that Rumsfeld and his father had this rivalry.
Okay. Before we move on to the next movie, is there anything about Donald Rumsfeld from the movie Vice that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you would like to mention?
No, I think you did a good job teeing it up. I'll just reiterate it. I thought the performance was great, and it made sense within the context of the film. On the discrete question of accuracy, which is not the main question for movies all the time, I thought it was a low grade, but I did like the movie.
Okay. Well, for entertainment, it is entertainment. It's not a documentary, right? Well, shifting gears to a different movie, we're going to 2008's W, which is a biopic about George W. Bush. And there's a scene in that movie I wanted to ask you about with Dick Cheney, who is Bush's VP at the time. And while Bush is having lunch, Cheney brings something for Bush to sign that will allow the U.S. to use, as the movie puts it, interrogation techniques against unlawful enemy combatants with maximal effective persuasion. Cheney goes on to say it's not torture, but it includes authorization for U.S. citizens if they're aiding and abetting terrorist organizations. Now, we don't see Rumsfeld in that part of the movie, but the impression that I got from the movie is that Cheney was the one behind some controversial things. And since we already talked about Cheney and Rumsfeld having a very close relationship, there's kind of an implied involvement for Rumsfeld as well in the movie too. Do we know how much influence Cheney or even Rumsfeld had over Bush's policies?
In general, and for policies, do you mean that interrogation or the policies in general?
Well, the scene was about the interrogation, I guess, specifically. But I guess I would assume that because that was something that would be seen as more controversial. Like if he wasn't already influencing policies and such, I guess I would just assume that they wouldn't start with something very controversial.
Good point. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And Cheney and Rumsfeld were very influential with Bush, Cheney in particular. So Rumsfeld was over at the Pentagon running the Defense Department, and Cheney was much closer to Bush, much closer confidant to Bush, although Bush and Rumsfeld had a good, strong relationship. It deteriorated some at the end, but it was a good, strong relationship for many years. And they held great sway over Bush, but it wasn't the simple caricature of the movies. I think Bush really respected Cheney and really respected Rumsfeld, and he gave their opinions a lot of weight. Now, it wasn't static either. I think it changed over time. So the key initiative for both Cheney and Rumsfeld, their biggest initiative was the Iraq War. And they really drove, I think both of them, maybe Cheney the most, but Rumsfeld certainly as well, really drove the push for regime change in Iraq and played a big role in convincing Bush to do it. Others in the administration were more ambivalent. Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and others weren't as hawkish as Cheney and Rumsfeld. But over time, in large part because the Iraq War didn't go well and didn't go the way Cheney and Rumsfeld actually suggested it would, I think Bush lost trust in them. Cheney gave a speech. It's a scene in the novel. He gave a speech in Tennessee where he says, verbatim, in quotes, Saddam Hussein definitely has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt. And that was in the lead up to the war. And he said that to the whole world. The whole world was watching. He said, there is no doubt. And he certainly was saying things like that to the president. And Rumsfeld was saying things like that to the president as well. And when it turns out Saddam Hussein doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, the erosion of trust is inevitable. And I think it really did happen. And by the time Bush was in the latter part of his second term, Rumsfeld had left the Pentagon, he resigned, and Bush and Cheney's relationship had frayed dramatically. So there's a huge difference between year one of the Bush administration, where Cheney and Rumsfeld hold great sway, and year 8 of the administration, where Rumsfeld's gone, Cheney holds little sway. And there was a, sort of a gradual decrease. It wasn't linear, but a gradual decrease over time in between those polar ends of the continuum.
Would some of that be what you were talking about before, where intellectually at least having, my way or the highway type approach to it, where, but you also mentioned that Rumsfeld was very big on following command. So the chain of command. So would that my way or the highway mentality still work for the president?
So Rumsfeld, very forceful in his views. If Colin Powell, his co-equal in the administration as Secretary of State in the first term, disagreed with him, Rumsfeld would charge ahead and give little weight to the disagreement. He was very, very confident in his own opinion and his own opinion about what was true, his own opinion about what to do. But when the president of the United States would say, here's what we're going to do, here's my decision, even if it went against what Rumsfeld wanted, Rumsfeld would follow that order. He respected the chain of command. And when he was Secretary of Defense, the only person above him was the president. That's who he reported to. So the whole world, it was my way or the highway, with the exception of the president. And certainly Rumsfeld had people at the Department of Defense and Cheney and others that he got along with well and respected their opinions. So it wasn't like he was disregarding every opinion anyone ever gave. But in general, he was very, very convinced he was right and the people that disagreed with him were wrong, but he would respect the chain of command at the same time.
Well, you might have already answered my next question, but in the W movie, if we're to believe that movie's version of history, Cheney and Rumsfeld were basically the reason why Bush went to war with Iraq over the WMDs, the weapons of mass destruction. Then at the end of the movie, we find out that what they thought were WMDs turned out to be photos of watering holes for cattle. So can you fill in a little more historical context around that situation? And then I'm assuming, based on what you said before, the movie is correct to suggest that Rumsfeld and Cheney were incorrect about the WMDs in Iraq.
Yeah, Cheney and Rumsfeld were the driving force behind the invasion. I think they were the two leading figures behind it. And one of the things that they talked about was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. I don't think Rumsfeld ever said it as categorically as Cheney, but Cheney did say it unequivocally. Even though there was disagreement in the intelligence community at the time, he still said it. He still said there's no doubt Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. So they were very vocal, and they were leading the push for regime change. They also talked about other issues as well. It wasn't just WMD. So they talked about the threat that Saddam posed in other ways to the United States and its allies. They also talked about the need to transform Iraq into a democracy, which in retrospect was much more difficult than they assumed. But that was one of the things they talked about, that if Iraq could turn into a democracy, that could change the region. They could be a model for other countries in the region to move towards democracy as well. So it was a mixture of things. But WMDs were very high on the list. And that resonated with the American people. So it was something that they focused on in terms of trying to get public opinion in support of regime change. Over time, we learned that Saddam Hussein never had weapons of mass destruction at the time. Now, you can always say, well, just because we didn't find them doesn't mean they didn't exist. But there were obviously a lot of eyeballs in Iraq after the invasion for many, many years. Nobody ever saw them. I think it's safe to assume they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and they were wrong. And that's a really striking thing to have happen. Again, Rumsfeld was a mix of positives and negatives, pluses and minuses. He was a smart man. He was very dedicated to his country. I think his intentions were in the right place in a lot of what he did. But it's a huge mistake to go out to the public, to the world, to the president and say, we need to get rid of Saddam Hussein because of these weapons of mass destruction, and for that to be wrong. So W embellished it a little bit, made it more of a Hollywood movie, exaggerated way of unfolding, as you would expect in a movie. But it's a good, fair, important criticism, because they said there were weapons of mass destruction. We went to war, which is the biggest decision a sovereign nation can make, and it wasn't true.
Looking back on it through a historical lens, do we know why they were so positive and, without saying without a doubt that he has them when they don't know for sure? Because obviously they didn't, so they couldn't have known for sure that they did. So why would they say that? I mean, was it just to try to go to war? I remember living through those times, and there was a lot of people who were like, we just want their oil or something like that.
I don't think it was that simplistic. I've never seen evidence that they did it just to put money in their pockets. And that's an incredible accusation, right? We're going to go destroy a country and have a huge number of casualties just so that my stock in an oil company goes up when I'm already very rich. So I don't think Cheney and Rumsfeld were motivated by enriching themselves. I think their motivations were complicated. They weren't identical either. And I think what you have really are two people that had very strong views about foreign policy, extraordinarily high confidence in themselves, right? Cheney and Rumsfeld are very confident in their own judgment. And they wanted what they wanted, and Rumsfeld in particular, they wanted to show that the United States was strong and a force in the world, and that there were consequences. I think they thought that during the Clinton administration, there were a lot of lines drawn in the sand, and then Saddam and other people would cross those lines, but there'd be no consequence. And I think for Rumsfeld, he thought it was really important to make a statement that if you're a dictator, if you're doing things like Saddam's doing, shooting at our planes, tried to assassinate George H.W. Bush, he invaded Kuwait. If you're a dictator doing all of these things, there's going to be consequences. And I think Rumsfeld wanted to make that statement, thought it was really important to make that statement.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess it's just interesting that, he still, well, I guess you said it was Cheney that was still so, saying it publicly like that is, well, I guess, as you also said, a mistake, big mistake.
It was a huge mistake. I think both men Cheney and Rumsfeld got a lot of unfair criticism throughout their tenure for a variety of things. A lot of decisions they made were very difficult decisions, and there was a lot at stake. But they deserved the onslaught of criticism and the historical condemnation. They deserve it because they said he had weapons of mass destruction. That was a huge basis for why we went to war, and it wasn't true. And that is a very, very major offense for a politician entrusted with the security of our country. Frankly, the United States military is entrusted with the security of the whole world in a lot of ways. If you're going to go to war, the ultimate step that you can take, it wasn't just a bombing campaign, it wasn't just discrete attacks with cruise missiles coming in, it was a war. And they did it in large part on the basis of something that wasn't true, and they exaggerated the position at the time. So they exaggerated what they actually thought. There was doubt. Cheney knew there was doubt. There was doubt. They exaggerated it, and then they turned out to be wrong. And that's a big deal, not something you can sweep under the rug. Even if you're trying to be fair-minded and recognizing their strengths and weaknesses, lots of criticism. And W, the movie, highlights that in a way that has some flourish and resonance with people, and I think helps people understand that.
Did it actually turn out to be watering holes for cattle like the movie shows, or is that just a Hollywood embellishment?
That was Hollywood.
Okay.
And to be a little more granular about it, there was a ton of evidence that Saddam had used weapons of mass destruction. There's a ton of evidence that he would do so again. There was a ton of evidence of infrastructure of weapons of mass destruction. And it was fair to say Saddam Hussein could get weapons of mass destruction. He could use them again. They just didn't qualify it. And so when they went in, there were all sorts of infrastructure and things related to weapons were discovered. It wasn't like Saddam only had rifles and a few tanks. I mean, he did have a lot of infrastructure in place. It just wasn't operational. And that's a fine distinction in a way, but at the end of the day, to say there's no doubt he had weapons of mass destruction was a big mistake.
Well, is there anything else about the movie W that you wanted to point out before we move on to the next one?
No, just another one where I think that a lot of respect for that movie. I think it's really entertaining, and I think does make some interesting points. But ultimately, if you're trying to really understand what happened, that's not the place to look.
Well, our final movie to talk about today is the documentary called The Unknown Known. And at the beginning of that movie, Donald Rumsfeld himself mentioned dictating some 20,000 memos in just the last 6 years at the Pentagon, and how there must have been millions of them over the course of his career. Then, of course, it goes on to use those memos as the basis of the documentary. And in the documentary, when the filmmaker asks Rumsfeld if he knew that they would produce a vast archive from his memos, Rumsfeld laughs and says never crossed his mind, and that even he didn't know what he was going to do next. So I have two questions about this. First, is it normal for a politician to have that many memos that are archived somewhere, presumably for the public to see? Maybe I don't know. The documentary didn't really point that out. But then also, do you get the impression that Rumsfeld was basically making it up as he went along? He kind of implied there.
So Rumsfeld, on the first question, Rumsfeld wrote these they're called snowflakes because they fell all over the federal government. And it was before email. If there was email at the time, Rumsfeld would have been one of those people that sends hundreds and hundreds a day. But it highlights a strength, and again, I think it's important if you want to be accurate to. There's a podcast about how accurate is a movie compared to reality, so I think accuracy is important. If you want to be accurate about Rumsfeld, you need to recognize his strengths, and he was incredibly smart man. Part of the big conundrum for me with Rumsfeld is how could somebody so smart be so wrong about Iraq, and not just the weapons of mass destruction, but what he thought he could do with the country, turning it into a democracy. He was clearly wrong about that. But he was a very smart man, and he was extraordinarily hard worker. I mean, if you look at the things people say about Rumsfeld, um, almost everybody that talks about him says he's the hardest worker I've ever seen. One of his friends that he grew up with, a guy named Ned Janetta, who has talked in given interviews about him, he said, this is the most productive human being that's maybe ever existed. Like he will wake up in the morning, and by the time he goes to bed, he will have done things that 10 people couldn't do. So he was just unbelievably, feverish in his work, his productivity. And he didn't just work all the time. He was really smart about it. When he left the Ford administration, the first time he was Secretary of Defense, he took over J.D. Searle. He was the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. They made NutraSweet. He took it from this fledgling, crappy, old legacy corporation to a total juggernaut, and the stock went up like tenfold in just a few years. So he's prodigious with his work ethic, his ability to get things done. And the snowflakes, which were very, very accurate and very real, I think reflect that, just the way he was able to get so much done. The problem with being that productive is if the ship's pointed in the wrong direction, it's a big problem. And the Iraq initiative, he put a lot of work into that, and we would have been better served if he had other focus of his energies during that time. In terms of the archive, he put them on the web, so rumsfeld.com. They're all up there. It's a great, great resource. You get all his memo, or at least a huge percentage of his memos. I don't know if it's all of them, plus a lot of memos from other sources. So it's all firsthand. So if you want to actually dig into the core of what was actually happening at that time and what people were saying, a lot of source material there that's really, really valuable and interesting. And his snowflakes were a big part of that.
So it was more work-related memos, not necessarily like a journal or keeping a diary type, just recordings and things like that. It was all for work purposes.
It's memos, from Donald Rumsfeld to Colin Powell, from Donald Rumsfeld to Dick Cheney, that sort of thing. And it's the actual workings of government. Like, you can do orders from there. You can give your positions. So it's not a summary of something else. A lot of the time it's the memo is the event. And it's really good history.
That sounds like with his work ethic, his work memos basically are his diary, his journal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes. When you work 16 hours a day or more, that's funny. That's a good way to think about it. Yeah. A lot of really busy people there. Their email inbox and outbox is their diary. But yeah, I think it's a good point.
What about that little line that he had in the documentary where he was like, he didn't even know what he was going to do next? Did you ever get the impression, I guess, that he was making things up as he went? Or, you said he was very smart, so I would assume that he have a little forethought.
He had a lot of forethought. He knew what he was doing, and he was aware of his legacy and his future. By the time he was in the Bush administration, he was in his late 60s. He was born in 1933. So he was in his late 60s when it started and into his 70s as he served as Secretary of Defense for the second time. So he wasn't positioning himself to go into the private sector and get this job or that job or run for president someday. He did run for president unsuccessfully in the 80s. It was very brief. But so he wasn't positioning himself in that sense. He wasn't thinking about his next move from a professional standpoint. When he stopped serving as Secretary of Defense, he did what I'm sure he assumed he would do. He wrote books. He participated in conferences and think tanks, speeches, and things like that. But yeah, he's a smart man who read history his whole life and was aware that in his way, he was making history. And there was a part of him, I'm sure, that was quite cognizant of that.
The whole concept of the movie's title, The Unknown Known, as Rumsfeld explains it, is Basically, the things that you think you know, but it turns out you did not. In the documentary, he uses the example of the attack on Pearl Harbor and says that happened because of a failure of imagination that the attack could even happen. Then, of course, as we all know from history, it turns out that Rumsfeld himself must have failed to imagine what could have happened because the world was shaken on September 11th, 2001. In Rumsfeld's case, shaken quite literally because he was at the Pentagon when one of the hijacked planes crashed into it. But then the reaction to that attack was the U.S. going to war with Iraq because of supposed connections to al-Qaeda, even though in the documentary, Rumsfeld himself says he doesn't think the American people thought Saddam Hussein was connected to al-Qaeda. But then the documentary shows a news clip from February 4th, 2003, when Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. And a reporter asks him to respond to Saddam Hussein, saying Iraq does not have weapons of mass destruction, and they also have no relationship with al-Qaeda. And in that news clip, Rumsfeld's response was, and Abraham Lincoln was short. Then he goes on to call Saddam Hussein the local liar, which to me is pretty obviously suggesting that he believes Iraq does have WMDs, as we've talked about, as well as a relationship with al-Qaeda, even though in the documentary he claims to deny it. Do you think Rumsfeld was purposely manipulating his words so the U.S. could have a reason to go to war with Iraq, or did I misinterpret what he's trying to say there?
I think what happened with Rumsfeld's public statements, my sense, and I've read and followed this really closely, is that Rumsfeld really wanted to go to war with Iraq. He really wanted regime change. He wanted Saddam out of there, not for oil money, not for bloodlust, but because he thought it was good for the world to get rid of Saddam Hussein and try to make the Middle East more of a democratic region. So he was very convinced that that was the right thing to do. And his public statements would be exaggerated or embellished to help that happen. And one narrative that resonated with people, because when you're going to war, and especially in democracy, you want public support. You don't want 90% of the people against the war and then you go to war. It's really important to have public support, to have political support, and have Congress behind you and our constituents behind you. So they were doing a marketing campaign for a year or two before the Iraq War. And one of the things Rumsfeld would do with respect to WMDs and also respect to connections to al-Qaeda is exaggerate, embellish, wink, wink, nod, nod. So he wouldn't outright lie in some grand way. Yeah, we know for sure that Saddam Hussein is in the process of selling WMDs to al-Qaeda. He wouldn't say that, but he would move the discussion in that general direction. And there were some connections between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, but they were tenuous. They didn't suggest that they were in cahoots together, but there were some connections between them. And then I also think Rumsfeld genuinely felt like Saddam Hussein, if he does get weapons of mass destruction, very easily, if not likely, would sell them to terrorists, right? He wants to cause problems to the West, to the United States. So the prospect of him selling them to terrorists, whether it's al-Qaeda or whether it's another terrorist organization, is a very real threat. So his views would be, and his statements would be consistent with that overriding impulse.
Was it almost like a means to an end? Like if he has it in his mind that he has to get rid of Saddam Hussein, almost, not that you can say anything, because obviously we talked about you not doing anything illegal or anything like that, but also trying to persuade people and trying to get people to follow along, then maybe we can stretch the truth a little bit here and there, or do things like, and Abraham Lincoln was short, that kind of quote.
It's a good way to put it, Dan. He wasn't outright lying in a obvious way. He was a smart guy, so he knew that if he lied, in a really obvious way, he would get called out on it. Unlike our politics of today, outright lies back then were harder to get away with. But he knew what he wanted to do, and he was trying to say things that would achieve that goal. And in that sense, he would exaggerate things and embellish things. but not outright lying, or going forward in some fraudulent way with evidence, things of that nature. He didn't do that, but he definitely was trying to be a good PR spokesman for what he wanted to get done.
You mentioned him thinking that Saddam Hussein might sell WMDs to terrorists. Was part of his motivation then, part of his reason for wanting to get rid of Saddam Hussein, basically to not have another 9/11?
Yes, I think that was part of it. I think he legitimately feared. I think 9/11 hit him very hard. When you're the Secretary of Defense and the largest attack in the country's history on our shores occurs, you're in charge. The Pentagon gets hit. He was in the Pentagon at the time. I think it had a very dramatic impact on him that a lot of civilians, particularly people looking back on it decades later, it's now over 2 decades later, don't feel the same urgency and fear that he felt. So I think it really did hit him very hard. And one of his concerns, I think it was a concern about Saddam Hussein, but I think it was also a concern about the region in general. Iran was a bad actor with respect to the United States at that time. There were terrorists, Al-Qaeda and other terrorists as well. I think he had just an overriding concern about terrorism and not wanting to have another 9/11. I think that drove him very strongly. And that fed into the overall basis for wanting to get rid of Saddam. Because he saw a real scenario where Saddam was a terrible dictator. He had tortured his people, he invaded his neighbors. He was an extremely dangerous person. And so Rumsfeld felt like he was a threat. How far-fetched is it to think that would actually happen if we had not gotten in and taken Saddam out? Would he have gotten WMDs and gotten him to terrorist hands? It's very hard to assess that, but I think that threat was one of several factors that drove Rumsfeld to want regime change in Iraq.
Something else that Rumsfeld says in the documentary that kind of sounded like a contradiction to me is when he says the U.S. doesn't assassinate the leaders of other countries, but then he immediately goes on to talk about Dora Farms, where the U.S. tried to kill Saddam Hussein. And that sounded like a contradiction because on one hand, Rumsfeld says the U.S. doesn't assassinate leaders, and then he instead calls the Dora Farms incident an act of war, implying it's not assassinating a leader if it's war. But then just a minute or so later in the documentary, he says that the U.S. wanted to kill Saddam Hussein to avoid going to war with Iraq. So maybe it's just me, but it sounds like Rumsfeld is trying not to use a specific word because the U.S. doesn't assassinate world leaders, but apparently the U.S. does launch a war against one person that just happens to be the leader of the country so they can avoid going to war with the entire country. What really happened with the Dora Farms incident, and what, if any, involvement did Rumsfeld have?
I actually don't know the detailed history there. I do know that Rumsfeld was pretty darn good about not getting caught saying things, but occasionally he would. And I thought the documentary on that point, it's hard to reconcile those various statements. And so, I think it was just, he wasn't being consistent was the takeaway that I got.
Well, the movies that we talked about today are mostly about other people. W, about President Bush, with Scott Glenn playing Rumsfeld. Vice, about Vice President Cheney, with Steve Carell playing Rumsfeld. And then, of course, there's the documentary, too. But there hasn't really been a biopic about Donald Rumsfeld himself yet. So let's say you're put in charge of directing it. Who would you cast as Donald Rumsfeld in your movie? And what period of Rumsfeld life would you want to focus on?
That's a great question. Well, you've asked the author of a biographical fiction novel about him. So if it becomes a movie, I'll be very happy based on my book, although that's hard. But I haven't thought about that. Who would play him? That's a really good question. I'm not skillful at casting. Josh Brolin seems like maybe he could play him. Steve Carell did a good job. I would want him to take a different tact, but he did a good job. I don't know. What do you think, Dan? Do you have any
Oh,
ideas
wow.
about who?
Throwing it back. I mean, I didn't even think about answering my own question there.
It's a tough question.
Josh Brolin would be good. I mean, he was George W. Bush in W, so it would be interesting to see him playing a different character in that same time period.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to picture somebody playing Rumsfeld. He'd have to be on the shorter side. Rumsfeld was 5'7". He'd have to be able to slick his hair back really well, because Rumsfeld did that. I feel like Brolin might be the best, but yeah, you're right. He was Bush, but maybe that would be a good thing. Maybe that would keep the theme going.
Yeah, there you go. And then you can have Christian Bale play George W. Bush in the movie as a side character.
There you go. I'm in. I'm watching that.
Me too. I'll have you back on to see what changes they made from what actually happened.
There you go.
Editing Dan here. And as I've been working on the episode, I thought about this question more. And now I'm leaning towards either Bryan Cranston or Harrison Ford. Bryan Cranston, because I think he can play that friendly politician side. And then in the same character, switch to the my way or the highway, much more stern side. Or maybe Harrison Ford, because he's been a politician in movies before, like Air Force One or even Captain America, Brave New World. And he's also been in more serious roles like K-19 The Widowmaker or even Patriot Games. But I think it'd be interesting to see what he can do playing a serious politician in a biopic for Rumsfeld. Who would you cast? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Well, this isn't a political show. Obviously, we are talking about a political figure from recent history. So, no doubt what Rumsfeld did in his career impacts our country today. What's one or two of the biggest things that you think Donald Rumsfeld's political career had on today?
Well, the Iraq War was very consequential. It essentially, because it near universal agreement that it was a big mistake and did not go well. Both the premise of the war with respect to WMD, but also the idea that we could go in there and transform Iraq into a democracy. In retrospect, people recognize was a real mistake and a real misunderstanding of what we're capable of in the Middle East. And so I think there's been a profound bipartisan recognition from the Iraq War that the United States, despite all of our power, needs to be more restrained in foreign affairs. And it's one thing to target militias with bombs. It's one thing to go after nuclear facilities in certain countries and things of that nature. But the idea of a full-scale mobilization around a smaller country that can't really defend itself like Iraq, I think is essentially off the table at this point. It's just not something that the United States has a stomach for, and I think that's a response to Iraq. And we learned that lesson. It's really hard. If you're going into the Middle East and bombing a country to smithereens and then building up a democracy from the rubble is just not something that we can do, even if it sounds like a noble goal. So I think that's really his legacy politically, is just being a part of that initiative, how it went and how it's reshaped our politics. And then his personal legacy to me is one that's very fascinating. I touched on it earlier, and one of the main things I try to bring out about him in the novel is he's a really complicated guy who was, on the one hand, really, really smart, and he was famous for recognizing, you mentioned it earlier in the documentary, Dan, talking about tiers of knowledge, right? And understanding the limits of our own knowledge. There's known knowns, there's known unknowns, there's unknown unknowns. And he articulated that framework in a really smart way. And he was right about the way he laid that out. So he's sort of this person, this historical figure who on the one hand is famous for articulating a framework of understanding human knowledge and our limits. And then on the other hand, the Iraq Initiative was one of the most notorious violations of the very framework he set in place, because he went beyond what he knew. He thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. He thought it was a known. He was wrong. He didn't have them. He thought that we could transform Iraq, and he couldn't. We couldn't as a country. And so I think his legacy is going to be, that complication of how does somebody so smart make such a big mistake?
To paraphrase, or to borrow, I should say, from another movie, with great power comes great responsibility. And sometimes, we learn the lesson, as you said. Well, this is a topic that we could continue to talk about forever, but thank you so much for coming on to talk about Donald Rumsfeld in the movies. You do have a new novel that you've talked about a few times. It's called The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld, and there's a link to it in the show notes for my listener to get their own copy right now. But before I let you go, can you give my audience a peek into your new book?
Yeah, it's an alternative history. So it's The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld, and Rumsfeld in the novel, after the Iraq War, through a series of scandal and tragedy, becomes president of the United States. So it's historical fiction novel and an alternative history. And then as president, really get to see Rumsfeld's full personality and character on display. And he makes some really big mistakes and ends up on trial at the International Criminal Court. And that's where the book gets its title, The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld. The actual trials around his activity in the Iraq War. And so if you like historical fiction, legal, political thrillers, it's worth checking out.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time, Will.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Really appreciate it. Love the podcast, and really thank you for letting me come on again.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. Thank you once again to William Cooper for helping us dig into the truth behind Donald Rumsfeld in the movies. If you're a fan of historical fiction novels, I would highly recommend you check out William's brand new book called The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld. As always, you'll find links to it in the show notes for this episode, as well as on the show's home on the web over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/375. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our two truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the two truths and one lie again. Number 1. Rumsfeld was a political rival of George H.W. Bush during the Ford administration. Number 2. Rumsfeld was inside the Pentagon during the 9/11 attacks. Number 3. Rumsfeld was known for advising George W. Bush against Iraq having WMDs. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Got the answer right here in the envelope, so let's open that up. And the lie is number 3. As William explained, Donald Rumsfeld was one of two leading figures pushing for removing Saddam Hussein in Iraq and claiming they had weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, the other being Vice President Dick Cheney. Although, as William pointed out, Rumsfeld didn't say Iraq had WMDs as categorically as Cheney did, but it's still pretty clear that that one is the lie. Thanks for sticking around to the end. If you are watching the YouTube version, here in a moment, you're going to see the credits roll. And if you want to get your name in the credits for the next video and on the website, you can learn how to become a Based on a True Story producer using the link in the description or over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with William and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.